Welcome, folks. Welcome to UCLA School of Law's briefing on expectations for COP28, which is set to open in about 3 weeks in Dubai. I'm Cara Horowitz. I'm Executive Director of the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at UCLA. The Emmett Institute was founded here about 15 years ago as the country's first law school center focused on climate law and policy. I'm really pleased to have several of my distinguished colleagues join me for today's conversation. I'm going to start by introducing them in the order in which they will speak, and pretty briefly. They're all very distinguished. I could go on forever, but I won't. Ted Parson is the Dan and Ray Emmett Professor of Environmental Law and Faculty Director of the Emmett Institute. Ted studies international environmental law and policy, as well as the societal impacts and governance of disruptive technologies, including geoengineering. His book, The Science and Politics of Global Climate Change, is now in its 3rd edition, and his work was influential in establishing the World Commission on Climate Overshoot, for which he serves as senior advisor and about which I think he will talk a little bit today. Mary Nichols is Distinguished Counsel for the Emmett Institute and served for many years, as many of you I'm sure know, as chair of the California Air Resources Board, one of the most influential and successful climate regulatory bodies in the world. She recently served as a member of the UN High-Level Expert Group on Net Zero Emissions Commitments of Non-State Entities, which was aimed at developing stronger and clearer standards to enhance credibility and accountability of climate change commitments. And Alex Wang is Professor of Law and Faculty Co-Director of the Emmett Institute. His research focuses on the law and politics of Chinese environmental governance, Chinese climate policy, and U.S.-China environmental cooperation and competition. He's a member of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, the Council on Foreign Relations, and he co-chairs the advisory committee of the California-China Climate Institute. So Ted, Mary, and Alex, welcome, and thank you all for being here, and thank you to our webinar guests. Ted, I'm going to start with you and ask you to give us an overview of the contexts and goals for this COP, hoping you'll situate it within the sweep of the history of the Framework Convention a little bit, and certainly of the Paris Agreement. And remind us what's on the agenda this year. Thanks, Ted.
Thanks, Cara, and welcome to our participants. Thank you for being here with us. As Cara suggested, I'll give a brief overview and context for the upcoming meeting and highlight a few of the items likely to be most prominent on the agenda, and also briefly identify a couple of things that probably should be on the agenda but aren't in a formal sense and will be interesting to see how they're treated. Are my slides coming through on share? Great. Okay. Oops, except I have to control them. Here. Okay. This is COP28. Everything's in code, everything's in acronyms. The 28th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the basic and original international treaty on climate change adopted in 1992. The Framework Convention in its text required and authorized the creation of a Conference of the Parties to meet annually. The conferences of the parties are authorized pretty much to do anything within the scope of the treaty. They can amend it, they can adopt subsidiary treaties, as they've now done twice, and they can do all manner of smaller scale decisions related to implementation of the commitments under the treaty. This meeting is not just COP28, though. The accretion of multiple institutions within the climate regime means that it's actually 5 official legal meetings all happening at the same time with slightly distinct mandates and legal statuses and all manner of opportunities for procedural confusion, because the 5 are basically addressing the same issues. So in addition to being COP28 for the original Framework Convention, excuse me, this is also the 18th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the Kyoto Protocol, which was the first subsidiary treaty adopted under the Framework Convention. Americans tend not to realize this or tend to forget it, but the Kyoto Protocol was adopted, entered into force, and is still in force, and it also requires annual meetings of its Conference of the Parties. This is also the 5th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the Paris Agreement, adopted in 2015. And in addition, it's the meetings of two legally established subsidiary bodies under the Framework Convention, the subsidiary body on scientific and technological advice and the subsidiary body on implementation. These two operate kind of like the official level intersessional parallel negotiations. Unlike all the conferences of the parties, these ones meet twice a year and they meet at the official level. And this will be their second meeting this year, where the officials run around crazily and frantically trying to clean up things to generate a clean agenda for the heads of delegations. What happens at COPs, really? So COPs are action-forcing events. They are deadlines. They are platforms. They are, of course, authorized to do real work, but the kind of real work that is done takes a lot of preparatory work. So there's usually rather few surprises. Typically, the main focus of attention at a COP is that over the prior year, there will have emerged one or two issues that are high in priority and conflict, and that can be encapsulated into the negotiation of some text that people are arguing over. And then a great deal of stormont, drawing, and stress within the 2 weeks of the COP occurs over how will this text get resolved? Are there too many brackets? What language will be used? It's hard to take steps of the concrete scale that we all think are necessary to make progress on climate change at the COPs, in part because it's only one meeting that takes place once a year. And of course, so it's a little unfair to say what was achieved at the COP, but also in part because of the way they run. They have formal decision procedures, and in particular, these COPs for the Framework Convention have very weak decision rules, because any attempt to adopt stronger decision rules, i.e. the ability to make decisions with less than consensus, has been blocked repeatedly, because you need to adopt decision rules by consensus in the first place, since the first COP in 1995. So consensus plus formal procedures plus 198 parties in the room, plus an amazing throng of other stuff going on, because I read an article about space junk last week, and thinking about the COP and managing the agenda and time at COP reminded me of the accumulation of, all the stuff that's up in orbit that's like now dangerous for satellites, because the now like 30-year history, 30-year history of this has accumulated so many actions that haven't really gone anywhere, that all spin off kind of procedural detritus. So we don't agree to do anything real, but we establish this process that requires meetings every year. Well, those meetings still have to take place. Or we didn't actually accomplish something, but we instruct the secretariat or some other committee to do more work, and it has to report back. So it's really confusing to see what's going on at a COP. There are dozens of things going on that are sort of formally required, but it's like there's not really any stakes or any hope of progress in it. And indeed, it's recently seemed to be the case that this might be creating an overhead burden that's making it harder and harder to do anything at these. We won't see any new treaties or amendments at this COP, not because they wouldn't be authorized to do it, but because doing that takes at least a couple of years of advanced negotiation, and so you always see it coming. The most recent one was at Paris in 2015. What you will see is a large number of decisions, actions taken subordinate to an existing treaty. It can be any one of the three: the Framework Convention, the Kyoto Protocol, or the Paris Agreement. And indeed, a lot of things have to be done in parallel on the three. So you have three separate negotiations producing very similar but not quite identical text, because each has to refer to its own instruments. Decisions implement previously agreed legal obligations. They also state intentions and confirm mandates for future decisions. So if there were to be a start of negotiations on some other treaty, something stronger on mitigation under the Framework Convention, there would have to be a decision to establish the mandate. There's also a bunch of parallel announcements at the political level by individual nations, groups of nations, side deals involving non-state actors. Okay, what are the main agenda items coming up on this COP? There are 4 that are likely to be prominent. They're not all important in the sense of having a significant chance of making material changes to what's actually done. The first and most important will be the completion of the first global stocktake. The global stocktake is a process that was established by the Paris Agreement in 2015. It's the main vehicle by which the rather weak and decentralized Paris structure was supposed to actually motivate stronger action. It's a process that has to take place every 5 years. This is the completion of the first one, that involves assessment of basically how we're doing, progress on emissions and on policies and on other matters. It's actually quite contentious among the parties whether the stocktake only applies to emission cuts or is also an assessment of progress on adaptation, finance, and other provisions. The official or analytic or data gathering phase of the stocktake was completed last month, and the news is not good. There's a synthesis report that, it tries to make lemonade out of a little bit, but in fact, we are not headed toward meeting the Paris targets. Current trajectories with current actions would take the world towards somewhere in the 2s for global average heating by the end of the century, 2.1 to 2.9. Or if you're really optimistic about the full implementation and maintenance of every pledge that's been made, even that isn't implemented in any action yet, you can get it below 2. Yeah, maybe 1.7. These numbers have a ton of uncertainty. I mean, the shocking over precision with which these numbers are stated in legal documents is sometimes kind of amusing. In particular, the synthesis report informs us that in order to have a 50% chance of limiting global average heating to 1.5 C, world emissions must be reduced by, wait for it, 43% below 2019 levels by 2030. 60% by 2035, net zero, not New Zealand, by 2050. The final political stage takes place at the opening of the COP, and we don't know what heads of delegations are going to do. They're supposed to look at it, make a decision about what to do. It's not specified beyond that. Second, the thing you've heard in the news is that this COP is supposed to operationalize the loss and damage fund that was agreed last year at Sharm el-Sheikh at COP 27. Loss and damage is the term used in the climate regime for those harms from climate change that are not avoided by adaptation. And the loss and damage fund is a financial vehicle intended to provide compensation for those harms that are not avoided by adaptation. So it's different from cutting emissions, and it's different from adaptation, new crop varieties, better infrastructure, public health systems, all the stuff that actually reduces the resultant harms. This has been an extremely contentious topic forever. The agreement to establish a fund was an empty shell last year. It was, we'll establish a fund and not another word. A transitional committee has had the mandate to work out the details over the past year. The negotiations have been slow and conflictual. And at the last minute, they pulled out a very uneasy text compromise in an emergency added-on meeting over the weekend in Abu Dhabi. The text that was released says the fund will be initially located in the World Bank. That was a major concession on the part of the developing countries who wanted a new independent entity under the Framework Convention. In a rather shocking event, as soon as the meeting closed and the text was released, a US delegate held a press conference and said the United States was very disappointed that the agreed text didn't explicitly say that the contributions to the loss and damage fund are voluntary. Now, the text doesn't say anything about there being either voluntary or obligatory. And so in the absence of further information, it's fair to assume they are treated as voluntary, although that's obviously also a strong point of conflict between industrialized and developing countries. The text also says nothing about numbers, how, to what degree the fund will be financed. There's really no information to go on, except given the reluctance with which a lot of industrialized countries have approached the even establishment of the fund, it's likely to guess that it's reasonable to guess the funding levels are going to be low, and estimates of the need for loss and damage are really big. They're in the hundreds of billions per year by 2030. That's a recent estimate by a high-level climate finance group, and it's for all the developing countries, excluding China. Last two things on the agenda, but in my judgment, not likely to amount to anything. There are three important agenda items left over from Paris. There was a commitment made in Paris to adopt a new collective goal for climate finance in total. So in contrast to the loss and damage I just spoke about, this is the whole thing. This is to replace the earlier unmet promise to mobilize climate finance of $100 billion a year. There was also a pledge made 2 years ago in Glasgow to double adaptation finance, adaptation being another component of total climate finance. Estimates are that that presently stands around 20 billion a year, and so doubling it would be 40. There appears to have been no progress on either of these negotiations. I expect some vacuous text to come out and be adopted that doesn't actually do anything. Another obligation left over from Paris is to adopt a global goal on adaptation. This one was very strange because the Paris Agreement said adopt a global goal on adaptation, but it said nothing about what that goal should be or what it should mean or how it should be pursued. And a subcommittee has been given the unenviable task of coming up with text for a framework for the global goal on adaptation, where we don't know what the global goal on adaptation is. Okay, how am I doing on time, Cara? Am I close to the end?
You have 8 minutes left.
Ooh, fabulous. Okay, so here's the stuff. Let me be a little personal. The stuff they should be talking about and will be talking about, but it's not formally on the agenda. And so it's going to be shoehorned into existing items, or there'll be some procedural maneuvering. First, how on earth are governments going to collectively increase their mitigation ambition to get closer to something that might be on a trajectory to meet the goals of the Paris targets? Basically, there's bad news every week. Last week, we learned about new estimates of the remaining emission budgets, i.e. the total cumulative amount the world can emit, consistent with different levels of temperature targets. The updates reflect some new results, which are a kind of a good news, bad news story. There is great success occurring in cleaning up sulfur pollution from fossil fuels, in particular from heavy shipping via a new regulation that went into effect from the International Maritime Organization last year to make a big reduction in the sulfur content of bunker fuels. Sulfur pollution from heavy fuels kills millions of people a year and also masks a large amount of the global heating that we'd otherwise already be experiencing from greenhouse gases. So it is both doing harm and helping on different environmental issues at the same time. It's a big ticket item, and cleaning it up is going to bring a big spike in near-term heating. Part of the new budget estimates reflect that. So the new budget estimates say, basically, if we want to stay within 1.5 degrees, we can everybody in the world, total world emissions, can continue at present levels for 6 years and then go to zero forever. Obviously, that is not a realistic trajectory. It's just a way of making vivid how tight the budget is. If you spend at your present level for 6 years, you'll be out of money in 6 years and you'll never have any again. 30 years for 2 degrees C. Watch the news for this. There is a scientific slugfest going on over just how big the effect of these reductions in sulfur emissions are going to be. The sort of, renowned, distinguished senior climate scientist, Jim Hansen, who has many times been in the lead of expansive claims about how bad things were, and has often been proven to be correct, has done it again with a paper that's in draft right now that says that a correct interpretation of climate sensitivity in view of recent reductions in sulfur emissions says we're actually going to pass 2 degrees C before 2050. His scientific colleagues are alarmed and find much to criticize in the work, and I'm in no position to judge it. It's really, in a sense, it's an unhelpful fight because they're fighting over how big the effect is going to be, but even the smallest end, it's going to be big, right? I mean, we're heating up too fast. This is going to make it faster. The emissions are not coming down fast enough. What can be done about this at COP? This will obviously be related to the global stock take. This is something that should be addressed under the Paris Agreement by agreements to tighten up the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, which are the national plans or statements of intention that governments make saying what they're going to do and what they expect to do in terms of reducing emissions. We'll see. Closely related, There's a lot of controversy over what, if anything, the COP should say about fossil fuels. Generally speaking, the Framework Convention has not spoken about fossil fuels, but 2 years ago at the COP in Glasgow, there was quite a sharp controversy over demands for a statement that would say, express an intention to phase out fossil fuels. That was weakened in Glasgow in several crucial ways. The language adopted called instead to phase down, not out, unabated coal power and inefficient subsidies for fossil fuels. The advocates of stronger statements are continuing to regroup and come forward. There's now 3 different coalitions of nations that have adopted various variants of stronger statements pledging to phase out unabated fossil fuels. The unabated part is a get out of jail free card for carbon capture and sequestration. You can keep using the fossil fuels if you bolt on hardware that removes the CO2 emissions before they pass the end of the smokestack and you put them away somewhere stable. The EU is now on record as having a phase out of unabated fossil fuels as its position. And just last week, there was a letter convened by an NGO with some 100-odd major international firms also calling for a phase out of fossil fuels. This COP is being held in a major oil producing nation, and the president of the COP is also the CEO of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, one of the largest oil producers in the world. He has been expressing mixed messages on fossil fuels, and although in one interview with The Guardian in July, he said, of course, fossil fuels have to go away, it's just a matter of when. By and large, he appears to be attempting to focus attention on promoting the good new stuff rather than phasing down the bad old stuff. So he's been mobilizing support for a statement at this COP that would call for very good things, a tripling of renewable energy capacity and a doubling of the annual rate of energy efficiency gains by 2030. The US supports that. Many renewable energy companies support it. Many other countries support it. This is very likely to be adopted. The questions are, will it actually have concrete details that make it a credible commitment to achieve those ends? And will that be all, or will there also be something said about fossil fuels? When I come back on in a few minutes, I'll speak with more focus about fossil fuel reduction and the Overshoot Commission. The last thing I'll say about what is probably around the agenda this time is that one of the good news places going on is methane emissions. There are huge initiatives, both jurisdictional and extra-jurisdictional and formal and informal, to cut emissions going on all over the world, mainly in the oil and gas sector. They are showing results. There is also a rapid expansion of the ability to observe atmospheric methane that's being driven by advances in satellite and aircraft measurements. The Emmett Institute actually has just launched a project digging into the implications of these advances for methane regulation. One thing you'll see at the COP is that many jurisdictions have been racing to push out new methane regulations so that the minister or secretary can have an announceable at the COP. And I expect many of those are going to be completed to some degree. So you will see some competitive boasting about we've adopted this regulation to cut methane by this much. I think that's that's all I've got for my introductory remarks. Thank you so much. I'll turn it back to Cara.
Thank you, Ted. Thanks so much for scene setting for us. I'm going to turn to Mary next. So Mary, I imagine you've been to more of these COPs than maybe you care to count. And I'm curious what you think is most interesting or important to pay attention to this year. And I'll especially invite you to talk about your interest in accountability frameworks coming out of your work with the high-level expert group, and whether you think there's likely to be any progress on that score this year.
Thanks, Cara. Thanks for the kind introduction. So I am going to actually pick up where Ted left off as far as methane is concerned, but I'll answer your questions first, because it's true that I am a multiple attender of COPs. I've been there both as an official representative of the state of California and as a private citizen going along with other NGOs and representatives of local and state governments as well. The common thread of all of this, and I think Ted alluded to this, but just in case there's anybody who's watching this who is not familiar with the format, The number of people who are actually in a room where negotiations are happening or in separate rooms is tiny in comparison with the number of people who actually attend the event. And this year, in part with the active encouragement, I believe, of Abu Dhabi, there are going to be more people there than ever. There will be, by different accounts, as many as 10,000 people. And they will all be under one gigantic dome out in the middle of the desert, using air conditioning and, enjoying lovely, brand new, state-of-the-art facilities, and putting on what amounts in some ways to a trade show. Only instead of only people demonstrating technologies and things that you can buy, there will be people there to promote ideas and to push the negotiators who are in a room somewhere to do stronger things than they might otherwise do, and do them better. Again, Ted's framing comments, I think, accurately depict what's on the table for the negotiators. And as you will observe, that bears not that much relationship to what's actually important in terms of whether or not we make it to 1.52 or anything else, which involves so much more action on the part of so many parties. But it's in general that the reason for that is because it's built off of a framework that the UN created decades ago and continues to amend, and the agreements that the UN reaches, even when they're adopted formally by the members of the UN themselves, are in a completely foreign language called UN speak and have no direct force over any of the members of the United Nations. It's not like a situation where the Security Council can say, a country is violating the peace in the region and send troops in. They have essentially no enforcement mechanism at all, other than the opinions of other members of the group. So I think there's a huge dichotomy between, what we hope for and the moral force that is possible within the UN, and what the actual any agreement that comes out of the COP will actually accomplish. Having said that, I would go back to the methane issue, because really for the first time at the last COP, but this has been growing for the last several years, more and more countries have been signing on to a separate convention on methane and have been coming to the COPs to brag about what they're doing in this area, in some contrast to what many of them have to say about issues like petroleum use or accounting for all of their emissions. In the area of methane, we have increasing data and an increasing awareness that this is one area where controls can be put in place relatively inexpensively, sometimes even with a net positive benefit, and can cost benefit, and can help to forestall some of the worst impacts of our continued emissions of carbon dioxide. So methane is a really great target. And even the oil and gas sector is interested in coming up with controls, in part as a way to deflect, the increasing pressure to get out of business completely, but also because there are technologies that some actors are much more able to adopt than others, and are doing better at. Another piece of good news, I think, is that we aren't going to be hearing a lot, as far as I can tell, anywhere at the COP about how natural gas is going to be a great substitute for oil. There's the science on this issue is so clear that although it's the amount of greenhouse gas emissions is half or so between gas and oil, that the reality is at best it buys you some time. So I'm not hearing or seeing a lot of the natural gas is the solution to everything talk coming around for this COP. But the piece of it that I guess I have spent the most of my time on in the last year or two is the issue of how do we know how good is the accounting for what is actually being emitted? How do countries actually benchmark and hold each other accountable? And then in turn, at the level outside or among those outside the UN body, the parties to the treaties, the people who are actually doing the work, especially within states and regions and at the local government level and in the private sector, how can we make net zero pledges that have been expressed or adopted by many entities real? And how do we use this as a way to, in turn, incentivize more investments in control? And the UN report that I worked on, the high-level expert group report, which came out in time for the Egypt COP and was done at the request of the Secretary General, was an international group of people, none of whom were in any official governmental position, but all experienced in the climate world within their own countries and from every continent, including China also as a member, and Japan and the Europeans and Africa, and Latin America. So it was a very representative and very interesting group. And the consensus coming out of that was we needed to set out some principles for how to prevent greenwashing at all levels, how to make these pledges real. And we've been busily now trying to spread the word. The UN managed to appoint not one, but two new bodies to implement this report. And they'll be coming back at the COP with even more specific details about how they want to see the annual reporting, the disclosure, the third-party verifications, and other elements of what our group called for. So I'm going to leave it at that and expect we'll go on with more in the questions and answers. Turn it back to you, Cara.
Thanks so much, Mary. Okay, Alex, you're up. I know you are closely tracking the evolving dynamics between the world's largest historic emitter, that's us, the US, and the world's largest current emitter, China. And I'm curious how you see those dynamics evolving and how you see all of that affecting potentially the outcomes from this COP.
Absolutely. So thanks so much, Cara. So let me just try to set the scene. You know, what I usually do when I go to these COPs is track what China is doing and how they're engaging, particularly with the U.S., but with other parties at the meetings. And what we'll see, I'm particularly interested in a lot of the informal kind of battle of framings going on at the meetings. I think to just set some of the context, you know, China is the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases now. It accounts for 29% of global emissions, right? With the US collectively, it accounts for about 40% of global emissions. And just China and the US alone account for about 14 times the emissions of the bottom 100 countries. And you'll see a lot of reference to the different ways of thinking about this, right? Cara mentioned the historical number, right? The US is still ahead, accounting for about 20% of historical emissions. China accounts for almost 12% of historical emissions since 1850. US is still ahead on per capita. China used to mention that its per capita emissions were quite low, but in recent years, even a decade ago, they passed Europe's per capita emissions. And given China's economic growth, the per capita emissions continue to grow all the time. And so we'll see a lot of kind of framings, battles about framings at the meeting. I expect that from the US and from the Western countries, there will be a lot of mention about the absolute volume of China's emissions. its continued expansion of coal-fired power in particular. I think from China, in the broad strokes, we'll see them continue to position themselves as the defender of global South interests. They'll highlight the historical contributions of developed countries to the problem and the need for the developed countries to contribute more to the financing and the capacity provision for solving the problem. And China will spend a lot of time highlighting its now quite substantial climate program, which, if you look, which really starting 15 or 20 years ago really began as a hodgepodge of non-climate oriented programs that had something to do with emissions, but now has really developed into quite a elaborated system. So what are some of the things that we'll hear from the China side? It's worth just mentioning some of the highlights from just the last couple of years that will be repeatedly emphasized, I think. I think many people are familiar with the so-called dual carbon goals that China, Xi Jinping announced these at the UN General Assembly in September 2020. This is the goal to peak emissions before 2030 and to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. China amended its sort of official pledges under the Paris Agreement in 2020, which included those dual carbon goals. It upped its carbon intensity goals. It increased its non-fossil sort of energy share targets, its forestry targets, and it provided specific numbers about the very large amounts of wind and solar it planned to install by 2030. But what's gotten a lot of attention in the last few years since then, starting in 2021, you really started to see headwinds for climate policy. China's chief development agency, NDRC, took over the lead role in executing domestically the dual carbon goals. Economic troubles, power shortages, geopolitics, COVID, the Russia-Ukraine war, these types of things led to really it's safe to say, a deprioritization of climate change. So, for example, in March of 2022, Xi Jinping gave an important speech in Inner Mongolia where he used a Chinese phrase that roughly translated meant build it before you break it. And it was widely seen as a signal to sort of not break down the coal-based system until more had been done to really fully establish an alternative clean energy system. And so what you've seen on the ground in China, and there have been a lot of headlines about this, is the really substantial, massive build out of coal-fired power still, 152 gigawatts last year in 2022, and on the same pace this year. And China's emissions are hitting historic levels. There are positive moves, which I think people are increasingly more aware of. I think the bright spots are, one is just the sheer size of the clean energy build out. China today generates enough power from clean sources to power Germany 6 times over, and that's up from 2 times over just a decade ago. In offshore wind, China's current capacity in offshore wind is the equivalent of what California hopes to achieve in 2045. By one estimate, by 2050, China could have about 60 times California's offshore wind. And then in electric vehicles, China accounts for almost half of the electric vehicle stock in the world. It sells about 30% of its auto sales each year are from electric vehicles. And of course, there are self-interested industrial policy reasons to do this, but these are the types of things that China will be actively presenting. On the diplomacy front, China just released a methane plan. Sort of observers have said that, sort of expressed disappointment in that it's a fairly general plan. It's relatively short, 14 pages or so, and it doesn't have numerical targets, and largely is about setting up systems and talking about the categories of work that will be done. And so it talks about improving monitoring and supervision systems and taking steps in the area of leaks from oil and gas wells, abandoned coal mines, agriculture, and waste, but nothing very specific just yet. And so whether there will be, a lot of people will be looking to see whether there will be a big US-China announcement, as there was famously before the Paris meeting. And then again at Glasgow, there was also an agreement. But hopefully we'll see something. I think China will feel the desire to be seen as constructive. And so we'll see what comes out of these meetings with John Kerry and Xie Zhenhua in California. And then there'll be further with Xi Jinping and Biden meeting next week in San Francisco. So I think one thing that we'll look for is just to see whether US-China and sort of Chinese engagement with the rest of the world can get back on track. I think we're seeing positive signs of that in the run-up to the COP, right? John Kerry has met with his counterpart this year in July. The Governor Newsom trip in October was quite successful and sort of set a very positive tone. And again, hopefully that tone will continue into the presidential meetings that are upcoming. In terms of other things to look out for, I think it'll be interesting to see how China continues to engage with the global South. Right, we're in a period which has gotten probably insufficient attention, which is that we understand that the United States and Europe have long exported their emissions. For many years, this was in substantial part going to China and contributing a portion of the emissions that China generates. But China is in the middle of, as its economic growth has continued, it's already been increasingly exporting its own emissions to other parts of the world, to global South countries. And so how does China engage with the global South? They announced in 2021 a ban on financing of overseas coal-fired power projects. But how will China contribute to the greening in the global South? That will be a really interesting area in which China both has an economic and a geopolitical interest in doing well. And the US and Europe are also kind of ramping up their competition, trying to build better relations with the global South and financing and making pledges to sort of counter Chinese moves through the Belt and Road and otherwise. And so I think those are a few areas to look out, and they all fall in the area of the sort of informal framings and the dynamics of image making. How is China perceived as good, or is China perceived as bad? Are they perceived as being constructive or a detrimental force? And then we'll see to what extent it turns into concrete action, both internationally, but in significant part also domestically as well. So I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Alex. And Ted, I'll come back to you for a few more minutes and invite you to talk a little more explicitly about your work with the Climate Overshoot Commission, which released a report earlier this year addressing the near certainty at this point that, as you've talked about, we're likely to miss our Paris Agreement targets. And I'd love for you to reflect on what you think that might mean or should mean for work at the COP.
Yeah, thanks, Cara. So I'll highlight 2 points from the recent report of the Overshoot Commission. So the World Commission on Climate Overshoot is an independent, informal, high-level international body. Like many world commissions and global commissions before it, it's a dozen odd people, former heads of government, ministers, and people of similar professional stature and visibility, not in office, globally representative, deliberating on some global problem and making recommendations that they hope official decision-making bodies will pick up. They have no official decision-making authority themselves. What they do have is the freedom that comes from being out of office and very senior to reflect on, what might be in the best interest of the whole world, rather than the brief that they had to carry when they were a president or a prime minister. So I think Cara's put a link to the Overshoot Commission report in the chat. It's really pretty interesting. I'm going to highlight 2 things that I think are particularly important and innovative about it, one of which pertains very directly and concretely to discussions at this year's COP. and one of which I can guarantee will not be mentioned at the COP, but is so important and so imminent in the realization of its importance that it should be, or it has to be soon. So the first of these goes back to the question of emission cuts and the treatment of fossil fuels. So here are two statements that would seem to be in tension with each other. One, what nature and the climate system see that matters is net emissions, and not even just net human emissions, net emissions from all human activities, all natural sources, and all the feedbacks and interactions between the two. That's what's changing the climate. That's statement one. Statement two, if you actually care about making significant changes in behavior that will make a difference, net emissions is pretty much the most ineffective and stupidly conceived target you could possibly choose. These are both true. Net emissions is an abstraction that has multiple, it's a house of cards that has multiple levels underneath it. Even emissions are not directly observed. Nobody sees the emissions of the United States. You know, satellites can't do that yet. I mean, maybe in some future world of extremely precise satellites, you really, and perfect modeling, you could. But even emissions estimates are an artifact constructed by a dozen statements of sort of aggregation and estimation and sort of opportunities for change at every step. Net emissions is even worse because it's basically taking an emissions and then crediting against it some removals that are occurring somewhere else that are attributed to the same agency. We're actually seeing, I mean, it is impressive the degree to which the discourse about cutting emissions or about solving climate change has come to be expressed in terms of net emissions. And it's impressive the hundreds and thousands of entities that have adopted net zero targets based upon commitments to reduce their net emissions to zero. But the closer those are looked at, and Mary has far more expertise on this than I from her work on the high-level commission that was actually all about improving the validity of these claims, the more it looks like current claims are substantially exaggerated. Of all the many systems of accounting and oversight, there are many that are very loose and few that are tight enough to be really reliable. And even many of the projects, the offsetting projects that have been granted credits, are not actually delivering the removals or the reduction in net emissions that they claim. There were a couple of studies within the past couple of years that were quite shocking in that regard. So all these statements about reducing net emissions and reducing fossil fuels with qualifications in the statements, in a sense, speak to this looseness, or they are falling prey to this looseness. One of the two things the Overshoot Commission did that was really important, and I think actually quite innovative and courageous, was they made a very concrete, blunt, and demanding statement about fossil fuels. Their recommendation is to adopt a phase out of production and consumption of fossil fuels, i.e. production and consumption over some sensible time horizon are going to go to zero. There's a few things about this that are sort of bracingly radical and clarifying. The first is simply talking about fossil fuels rather than talking about emissions in the first place, because in contrast to the constructed artifact that is emissions, production of fossil fuels is an observable concrete act, which is observed by the relevant authorities, often taxed, and subject to all kinds of administrative and regulatory interventions. It's like, you know what's happening. You know what's happening when it's produced. You know what's happening when it's imported. And so this is a measurable and thus controllable quantity. Second, the commission said, go to zero, not right away. Goodness, no, that would be crazy, like impossible, catastrophic. But make a commitment now that the end point is zero, and make that commitment in some form that the commitment is actually credible. This actually represents a kind of a leap beyond the most aggressive demands of the coalitions that are going hard on fossil fuels right now. They're all trying to choke off near-term investment in new production of new fossil resources. But a credible statement that there is an endpoint to the lifetime of this commodity, even if it's 25 years from now, and that would actually be a sensible time horizon. It's like, it'd have to be long enough to sort of amortize most of the investments that have been made before, not all, but most. But it would have the effect immediately of making new investment unattractive as a commercial proposition. And that has an extraordinarily galvanizing effect. The other thing that makes the Commission's recommendation sort of so credible and serious is it intentionally imported a few elements of the highly effective phase out of ozone depleting chemicals that was adopted in the Montreal Protocol. I don't have time to go into the details there, but basically they crafted an effective set of regulatory commitments that really did have the effect of reducing an important area of industrial activity to zero. And the lessons from that have not been entirely mined. A key piece of it is that when it really starts to get tight, the escape valve or the pressure relief valve takes the form of an exemption for essential uses rather than a conversion of the basic obligation into something unobservable and slippery like net emissions. So watch for impact of that, watch for that showing up in the language and proposals of the various actors who are trying to configure recommendations on fossils that are in that sweet spot where they are radical enough to actually make a difference and yet not so radical that they can be arbitrarily dismissed or ridiculed as non-serious. Because this is very much a serious proposal, although also a radical one. I know I'm almost out of time. I will say, like, in less than 1 minute, the other thing the Commission did that was remarkable was it very courageously made a strong recommendation regarding research and consultations on solar geoengineering or solar radiation modification, the technological interventions that have been identified for about 20 years, totally marginalized in discussions of climate policy. Mainly, you can think of this as the leading example of how this would be done would be spraying reflective aerosol, a mist of fine light-colored aerosols in the upper atmosphere to reflect away about 1% of sunlight. This stuff will radically transform climate debate. Although research has not been given the resources it needs, most of the research that's done is extremely promising. It really looks like this could work with small side effects. It could work in a way that is beneficial globally with no major winners and losers. It's cheap, it's controllable on timescales of a couple of years. It has a bunch of risks and uncertainties. It poses profound disruptive questions of governance and law and policy about how it would be controlled, because it would be a technological artifact that unavoidably changes the whole world. But worry about the political and governance implications of it has been so pronounced that basically people have refused even to talk about it or to support research for it. What the Commission did was a very careful step forward toward a reasoned discussion about this that has a balance of two things. They recommended countries adopt a moratorium now on any large-scale interventions using these technologies, basically as a kind of a confidence-building, calming measure. Say, yeah, we know everybody's worried that people will do this hastily and recklessly, and we're declaring that we're not going to do it. And then in parallel with that, they have a set of recommendations to expand research, international consultations, capacity building for research in global South countries, and discussions about how to surmount the severe problems of how to govern it. You won't hear about this anywhere at this year's COP, except in a couple of side events, but you're going to hear more and more about it over the next couple of years because things are so dire, there will be a turning of attention toward this. So what I said about 1.5 being out of reach, here's the crazy thing. 1.5 is not out of reach. It's only out of reach if you won't ever consider solar geoengineering. Solar geoengineering could hold temperature limits to 1.5 if responsibly researched, governed, and deployed. That's enough.
Thanks, Ted. So if folks have questions, I encourage you to put them in the chat. We are monitoring them. We've been answering some of them as we've gone along. I'm happy to start pitching some of them into conversation here. And the first one I think I'll do that with is this question about whether there are efforts within the framework of the COP to end subsidies for fossil fuels, or in other ways to create a more level playing field for renewable forms of energy generation. I don't know if anybody wants to take that one on.
I can do quickly on that. So the IMF now annually tracks fossil fuel subsidies. Their recent report came out just a few months ago. It's kind of shocking. It says last year there were $7 trillion. But when you look under the hood, it's more difficult than it seems, because 60 to 80% of that 7 trillion is not actually payments from treasuries, it's unpriced externalities. So they conceptually correctly, but perhaps misleadingly in terms of policy terms, they call it a subsidy that fossil fuels are not charged for their climate and air pollution externalities. Okay, so yeah. So yeah, I mean, you could price them and that'd be great. And that carbon tax should be really high. And then second, the piece that does come from the Treasury is almost all consumption subsidies in middle and low income countries. And that went up a lot over the past year or two because of increases in fossil fuel prices. They are subsidies. They could be cut back, but in fact, they're mostly in low and middle income countries, and they're mostly going to consumers. So the notion that this number is dominated by payments to sort of corporate fat cats who are producing it below cost in, United States and Canada, yeah, there's some of that, but that's actually a small fraction of the total.
Mary, did you want to weigh in there?
Just to the exact question, though, there will be no discussion of that at the COP. The information is out there, but it's not going to be discussed.
Thank you, Mary. That's the question I should have answered.
But there will, as I understand it, I think, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, be conversation about boosting renewables. So, there's very little being done to suppress these subsidies to fossil fuels, but in terms of leveling the playing field, maybe some conversation of boosting subsidies or support for renewables. Okay, another question from the chat is whether you each see appropriate roles for big business or industry at the COP itself. We've talked about how there's so much happening at the COP beyond and different from the actual negotiating sessions. And there have also been a couple questions in the chat about the degree to which, especially maybe at this COP, big oil is likely to have a big presence at the COP. I wonder if you each want to reflect on the influence or role of industry at these COPs and whether it can sometimes be productive.
Well,
Mary, why don't you start?
I'll start. The answer to that is absolutely yes. I mean, over the years, some of the increase in attendance at these events, at all of the ancillary events and side meetings, has been from companies that are genuinely interested in seeing action occur. And even in the case of big oil, while obviously when they're there, there's a tendency to have this be a defense, and that's particularly going to be true this time because we've got state-owned oil companies, including the host, present, who are very eager to position themselves as being somehow part of the solution. So they're not going to be putting forward, as Ted had indicated earlier, any proposals that meaningfully lead to an end to their doing business with the oil that they have. And that's true of the other oil and gas producing countries that own their own oil as well, because they don't feel that they can. But for other industries that are there, take, for example, in our own California delegation, the electric utilities, the manufacturers of electric vehicles will both be very well represented there. And they're there to promote a view of the solutions, which I think most environmentalists, most of us would agree with. And some people will be there with sort of alternative visions about how to keep the emissions levels or the temperature increases within the lines of what the science calls for, including people from the building and construction industry, people who manufacture reflective surfaces that can be used on a very localized basis to actually reduce the temperature in a particular physical community. And people who are there talking about agriculture and forestry, the whole nature solutions, which we tend not to talk about so much here, but which are an incredibly important part of the equation, will be there, and they will be there with visions to promote as well. So the fact that they're not necessarily on the agenda of the conference itself doesn't mean that they won't have an impact. It will be muted, I guess. Muted would be the right word, and somewhat delayed.
Over time, and as things get worse, more and more business interests are actually aligned with solving the problem.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Mary referred to the really substantial power of businesses that are new technologies and energy systems and materials that actually prosper from reducing emissions. And then the sectors are kind of expanding. It's like the whole financial sector, capital, insurance, these stuff don't care. Those folks don't care how they make their money. They just want to make their money, and they don't want to be exposed to big risks on their investments. And so, business and capital are not one thing. It's a huge variety of things. Even fossil fuel interests, it's like their ambitions have contracted a lot over the past 10 years. And that's part of the reason why the upper bound climate projections are now in the order of sort of 3 degrees rather than 5 or 6. And that's a really good thing. And the most sophisticated ones, they're all maneuvering to be the one who pumps the last barrel of oil, but they're also more and more maneuvering to be the ones whose next business life is being carbon removal and management companies. That'll be a set of thorny questions to be addressed, policy, legally, environmentally, and so on. But there's going to have to be an awful lot of removals, and the firms that are best positioned with the expertise and the assets to do it are actually the ones who've been pumping the stuff out of the ground so far. So watch this space.
And just very briefly, the Chinese companies started going to these meetings probably around the time of Copenhagen, and almost 15 years ago. And these days there are, to the points that both Ted and Mary made, there are a lot of Chinese companies that are now quite interested in getting involved in green finance, and making money off of these, the green development, essentially. So I don't know exactly the scope of who will be there at this meeting, but I'll look forward to seeing what they're saying and to what extent you can sort of tell how serious they are.
Thanks, Alex. So on the topic of carbon removals, Ted just mentioned the phrase. We do have a question inviting you each maybe to speculate on how valuable you think the topic of, or the technology of, carbon removals is likely to be in the future. Is it very valuable? Is it a distraction to these conversations? Thoughts on carbon removal? Very welcome from you if you have them.
Am I allowed to say yes to all of the above?
Yeah, sure.
Essential at enormous scale, and also a big risk of being a distraction. So, we're already in a situation, and the projections take us far beyond, where there will have to be billions of tons removed to establish a stable climate at anything like familiar past patterns. And that'll have to be paid for, and somebody will have to do it. And the big worry there is, can it expand fast enough to sort of shave the near-term risks down? And at the same time, can that fully substitute for or replace the need to cut emissions in the near term? No, it can't. Emissions really need to go to zero, because that's more reliable than saying I'm going to emit today and then take back double next year or next decade.
So I might just add that there's an important distinction which sometimes gets lost in conversations that I've heard between direct air capture and carbon removal from the atmosphere. So one obviously involves taking the CO2 that would be emitted from a smokestack or other direct point source and taking it and doing something else with it other than letting it go into the atmosphere. It can be either converted into a useful product or stored. The other involves taking stuff that's already out there in the atmosphere, again, finding it, getting it, and then doing something useful with it. The latter is even less well demonstrated, technologically much more expensive, but also a goal very much to be promoted. The former is the one that I think people worry will allow oil refineries, for example, to prolong their lives while they continue to operate. And I think back to the point that really Ted laid out earlier, if there were an endpoint that was clear that, X refinery was going to have to shut down, by 2040, 2050, whatever, the desire of investors to jump in and help with that a way of keeping that company going would be substantially reduced. The price for doing it would be a lot higher. But on the other hand, if you're going to let it continue operating during that amount of time, it's in everybody's interest to be taking the carbon away. So the issue really for the financial community more than anybody is how can you price this, without, in the absence of an absolute endpoint, how do we figure out, how much we should spend and how to eliminate the stuff that will continue to be emitted anyhow. But the technology in this area is much better developed and understood. It's just more, it's still very expensive.
And I underscore the very important distinction that Mary drew. If you take it out before the end of the smokestack and you really do put it somewhere that it doesn't get into the atmosphere, then that is emissions reduction. It's not subsequent removal. And we expect and hope that that's what people have in mind when they put that word unabated into this fossil fuel language. But if that word gets even more slippery and elastic and abated starts to mean, oh, you didn't end the emission, you just promised to suck it out, over there, that's another step toward perdition. So.
Thanks, Ted. Thanks for those thoughts. I know we're coming up against our time limit here, so I'm going to end with one last question from the chat, which is also happened to be a question I wanted to ask you. So it's nice to have that confluence. And it's about what you think the best outcome from this COP might reasonably be, right? How will you know if this COP succeeds, or what will you call a success? And I'm going to call on you, actually. I'm going to call on Alex, then Ted, then Mary. You're going to get the last word.
So I'm feeling in a bit of a pessimistic mood. I'm not expecting a whole lot specifically to come out of here, but I note that, this is, part of Ted's presentation was to note the global stocktake and to highlight the ratchet mechanism of Paris. And this is meant to set us up for the next round of NDCs, I guess in 2 years, right? Isn't that right? And so, for the world's largest emitter, I'm hoping that will dovetail. It's about the time a lot of people are saying that China could actually peak, ahead of their actual 2030 target. A lot of people think they can do it quite a bit earlier. So maybe they can set up a situation where they are maturing the idea so that they can do a much more ambitious NDC in 2 years.
Thanks. Ted.
Well, this might be too much to hope for, but I mean, what I would hope for is a kind of a shocked epiphany on the part of the senior political leaders of a dozen of the world's largest emitters and most climate vulnerable countries to suddenly realize, oh my God, the world is burning around us and we're fiddling over this text about $10 billion. And they resolve seriously to go off and cut a side deal that would then be implemented in their NDCs. This would not be a negation of the Paris framework. It would be vigorous additional action by a leading subset within the Paris framework that would look more like serious near-term cuts on emissions, or better still, on measurable things highly correlated with emissions, like fossil fuel consumption. And it just occurred to me now, it's like you could take half a dozen of the biggest emitters and half a dozen of the countries that have experienced the most severe, sort of desperate impacts within the past couple of years. That list is getting pretty long, and you could try to get a deal kind of among them. It would be a sort of a proxy for a subsequent global deal.
Well, I think sort of all these points have really been touched on, but I would add that I'd like to see an agreement not to meet again next year, but to, move the COPs to every 2 years, but in between times, schedule more work at the committee level, particularly among methane people, those interests that are most involved in methane, and also in the finance side, to continue working and to issue regular progress reports on how they're doing. One of the things that I'm afraid happens, and it'll happen again, and it may be that we're contributing to it even here, although we have highlighted some of the areas where progress has been made, but there's still an overwhelming sense on the part of many people that the situation is hopeless. So why I am not one of those people. I don't think any of us in this conversation are in that category, but we don't do enough to say where we've actually seen change happen that's been good. And there has been a lot of it that we can be positive about, including the continued willingness of China and the US to work on these issues together in spite of everything else that we disagree about. So I think I'd like to end on that point, that it would be a positive sign if there would be a couple of specific things that everybody will agree on in terms of how to improve the accounting and the reporting on how everybody's doing under the stock take, but then to agree that this big extravaganza doesn't have to happen again for 2 years.
Thanks so much, Mary. And thanks to each of you for joining us. I found this really enlightening. I'm sure that our attendees did too. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. We did record this. We'll post the slides and the recording, and you'll get an email to figure out where those live on the internet. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.